There are many different questions people raise regarding the ethics of traveling, such as how much one is allowed to bargain, or what type of transportation one should use, where to stay, so for example in a local guest house or in some Western hotel chain. And there are many more questions like that. But since tourism contributes to 9% of global GDP and accounts for 1 in 11 jobs worldwide, the answer to such questions might be more important than we would intuitively expect. But while some people already discuss where one should stay once one has reached the destination, a much more important question seems to be entirely neglected, and that's the question where we ought to travel to in the first place. And that's pretty much what I want to focus on today. But I must admit that some people do at least discuss where one should not go. So for example, to places where by going there, one would support an autocratic regime. And that makes, at least intuitively, a lot of sense. But even if that's the case, there's still quite a few places left from which people can pick their destination. So does it then mean that it's morally equal to go to Kenya or to Australia? I don't think so. In fact, I believe that one should rather travel to low-income regions which are disproportionately affected by poverty than to high-income regions. So in my example, one should rather go to Kenya than to Australia, or more generally speaking, one should rather go to regions in South and Southeast Asia and many parts of Sub-Saharan Africa and some regions, I guess, in South America, rather than to Europe or Australia, where the vast majority of people travel to nowadays. So for example, last year there were more tourists in France alone than in all over Africa combined. And although there are many different factors which have to be taken into account in order to ultimately decide where to travel to, I would like to focus on the two major reasons today only, which led me to believe that traveling to low-income rather than high-income regions is at least a good rule of thumb to start with. But first, let me mention that obviously there are many different ethical theories out there. However, if you're like most people, you believe that the consequences of an action should matter at least to some extent. Maybe it's a decisive factor, maybe not. But if they matter to some extent, that's enough for now. And among those consequences would then certainly be the contribution of one's action to the overall happiness and or well-being of those who are affected by that action. So in order to determine where we ought to travel to, we would have to have a look at the impact traveling has on the overall well-being of those who are affected by your travels. And since one of the immediate effects of traveling derives from the fact that money is spent in a different part of the world, we would have to analyze whether money spent in one region of the world leads to more or less happiness than that money spent in a different part of the world. So we need to know a bit more about the relationship between money and happiness, and more specifically, whether the same amount of money influences everyone's happiness equally. I also must admit that analyzing happiness is, as I'm sure you can imagine, rather difficult and involves a number of uncertainties. However, there seem to be two main ways how surveys in this field of study are usually conducted. And the first one asks whether somebody is satisfied with their life as a whole, so-called life evaluation or life satisfaction. And the alternative would ask, how happy are you these days? And while the data on this so-called emotional well-being suggests that one may not become any happier after having reached a certain stable income, well, at least not happier due to further increased income, which according to Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton was estimated at around $75,000 per household in the US. The data on life satisfaction, on the other hand, suggests a much stronger relation between income and happiness, or life satisfaction for that matter. In fact, it suggests that the more you earn, the more satisfied you are with your life. However, even regarding life satisfaction, money seems to become less and less important. So if we have a look at this graph, we can see the very interesting pattern that life satisfaction rises by about 0.3 points whenever we double income. Right? So here we have annual income on the x-axis, where the difference between each tick mark represents a doubling of income. And then on the y-axis, we have life satisfaction on a scale from 1 to 10. And if we double income, as we can do here for China, we can see that life satisfaction rises by 0.3 points, right? And we can see the same effect for Iran, for Japan, and for many other places. The blue one on the top represents the US. So it's always the same, regardless of where you live, how much you earn. Double income and life satisfaction rises by about 0.3 points. So for instance, if you would like to increase the life satisfaction of somebody living in the US, earning the median income of 31,000 US dollars per year, you would need an additional 31,000 US dollar per year. But if you would like to increase the life satisfaction of somebody, of an Indian farmer earning as little as $300, you would only need an additional $300. And due to this extremely different effect money can have on people's well-being, which is ultimately based on extreme global economic inequality, the philosopher Will MacAskill calls this the 100 times multiplier. You may well say not all the money you spend as a tourist will go to somebody who earns as little as $300. That seems highly unlikely. But even if that's the case, it may still go to people who arguably profit much more from that than anybody in a high-income country could. So let's take the case of the around 300 sulfur miners at Ijen volcano, which is located in, as you can hopefully see, in eastern Java in Indonesia, who earn about $13 per day. So much more than some of the poorest people in the world have, and also much more than some of the poorest or rather poor people in Indonesia have. But their job does come at a rather high cost, as they frequently break their collarbones because of the heavy weight of the sulfur they have to carry, which can be up to 200 pounds. A miner at Ijen also risked dying immediately from toxic fumes blowing in their face, from which already 75 miners died. So there's actually a substantial risk that this can happen. And a miner at Ijen also has a life expectancy of 20 years below the Indonesian average. So why did I tell you this story? To illustrate mainly 2 points. The first one is that even people who earn much more than the current threshold of extreme poverty at $1.90 per day, which is still the case for around 700 million people worldwide, although those numbers are declining, those people may still live and work under pretty horrible conditions, which to most of us in the West are simply unimaginable. And the second point is that even if your money doesn't go to somebody who earns as little as $300 and by that achieves 100 times more good, those people can still massively profit from tourism. At Ijen, for instance, some miners were able to quit their jobs and offer guided tours for tourists into the crater, away from the most dangerous and poisonous traps. Even if this may not be their dream, some, at least to me, seemed at least reasonably happy about what they were doing. But even if that is not the case whatsoever, they sure prefer to have this option of showing some tourists around a beautiful landscape for a couple of hours per day, rather than working under life-threatening conditions every single day for about 16 hours. But traveling to low-income regions may not only benefit the local population. And this now brings me to my second point. In fact, I believe that it may have better consequences for all of us. And more specifically, I believe that it may help us to overcome certain intuitive moral gut reactions which we have for evolutionary reasons, but which may not necessarily lead us to do the right thing. So something many philosophers or people in general subscribe to is that the interests of people should count equally. And although we like to tell ourselves that we do in fact value interests equally, in practice at least that's often not the case, as one of those intuitive gut reactions we have evolved over time is to favor, prefer, and empathize more with those who are like us. So if we have a look at the reaction of the West to the terrorist attack in Paris on Charlie Hebdo in January 2015, where 12 people died, and compare that to the reaction of the West to the multiple terrorist attacks in northern Nigeria during the exact same week, where 2,000 people died. And the problem seems to be that this isn't a one-time thing. In fact, it always occurs in a similar way, and I'm sure you can imagine that there are countless examples of that. But while multiple governments and even Facebook were able to reconsider and ultimately remove their one-sided responses to such incidents altogether, our two intuitive gut reactions remain, and this may even be the bigger problem, will remain the same. Josh Green, a professor of psychology, and his student Jay Musin conducted an experiment, which is unfortunately not yet published, but hopefully will be soon, in which they asked participants to imagine that they're on a vacation on a small, beautiful island in a rather poor country, overlooking the coast from your cottage in the mountains, and everything is going really well. But then a terrible typhoon hits the coast, and there's flooding, and at some point diseases become a big problem, and you can't really go down there. But what you can do is that you can make a donation and to the aid organization already working on the ground, and then they ask people, well, do you believe that you have an obligation to help? And in fact, 68%, or roughly 68%, said yes, we do believe that we have an obligation to help under such circumstances. But then they ask a slightly different question. So everything was exactly as I described before, but now instead of you being over there, it's your friend who's over there, and you're at home, but your friend is showing you all kinds of photos and videos and news and whatnot, so you have just as much information as you had in the previous case. And since you also can just equally donate to the aid organization which is working on the ground, you also have just as much ability to help. But when they ask participants now whether they believe that they have an obligation to help under such circumstances, only about half as many people said that they believe that they have an obligation to help, and that's somewhat strange, right? The only difference is that once you're sitting there and now you're sitting here. If somebody would ask you whether you would like to donate to a specific cause, you certainly wouldn't respond by asking that person whether the potential recipients of that donations are more or less than X miles away, because that's simply where you draw the line. From a certain perspective, that just doesn't make sense whatsoever. But from a biological perspective, it makes a lot of sense. We evolve to cooperate in small groups, and if there's somebody right in front of us, that's when we act and we help, and that's nice, and so on and so forth. But if there's somebody in danger far away, we don't care much. It's not really a problem our hunter-gatherer ancestors had to face. But it is a problem which we are facing right now, when about 30 million people face starvation in northern parts of sub-Saharan Africa and Yemen, or when there are still 17,000 children dying every day from preventable diseases. And since our thinking processes won't adapt anytime soon to solve issues of a globalized world, rather than tribe internal issues for which those mechanisms have been designed for, I believe that we need to change our environment. We need to travel to low-income regions rather than high-income regions in order to empathize with people with whom we would otherwise not empathize with. But traveling may not only bring us geographically closer together and thereby enable us to value people's interests at least a bit more equally, but it also, as by now multiple studies have shown, increases trust, open-mindedness, and the ability to make more informed judgments about global issues. But to be realistic, traveling even to low-income regions won't expose you to some of the greatest injustices like extreme poverty, and most likely you won't see some of those 17,000 children dying every day from preventable diseases. That seems highly unlikely. But it will expose you to some of the very common injustices, like the situation of the miners at each volcano. And by that, I believe that traveling can also shed some light on our ways of thinking, and more specifically on how our thinking is not just randomly, but really systematically wronging those who are not like us, those who have different beliefs, interests, or simply live a few miles further away. And although this reason is not as quantifiable as the previously mentioned immediate benefits on people's well-being, I believe that in a globalized world with nowadays increasing tendencies of nationalism and xenophobia, overcoming tribalism is really important. And if we're able to make all of us in a certain way better off simply by traveling to low-income rather than to high-income regions, then I believe that we should do so, and I also believe that we should try to encourage others to do so as well. Thank you.